Politics moves faster than ever, and uncertainty is the new normal. Welcome to The Pulse of Politics, the podcast about public affairs and how to navigate an unpredictable world. Each episode brings you real cases, best practices, and a look at how AI is reshaping policy work. Let's get started. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Fred, a very well welcome to the Pulse of Politics podcast. It's a pleasure and a huge honor to have you as a guest today. Thank you for joining.
It's great to be here, Sylvan. Thank you.
You are the principal at BGR Group, an international and trade practice, and you're also the former chief of staff to the chairman of the U.S. Senate's former Foreign Relations Committee. Before we talk about everything you've done and built, I actually want to start with your time on Capitol Hill. You spent more than 25 years there, from the House to the Senate to the Helsinki Commission, before crossing to BGR in around 2021. What drove each of those transitions for you, and was there a single moment that sort of crystallized why Washington was your place, the right place to be for you?
Sure. And thank you again for hosting me. You know, Sylvan, I would say it goes back to growing up. I grew up in a small town in northern New Jersey, the east coast of the United States. And my family was involved in local elected politics. My father served on the small town council where I grew up. It was a volunteer position. So he was a small town lawyer by day and volunteered on our town council in the evening. And from that, I sort of got my interest and passion in government and politics. And I went to university in Washington, D.C., both for an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree. And when I finished, I got a job on Capitol Hill, and I figured I would stay there maybe for a year or two, and then I would move back to New Jersey. And we have an expression here that man plans and God laughs. And what I thought would be a year or two turned into 25 years of working on Capitol Hill, first for a couple members of the House of Representatives, and then I was staff director of the U.S. Helsinki Commission. It's a bit of a nickname. The formal name is the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. I did that for 7 years. And then, as you mentioned at the top, then I was the chief of staff for the chairman of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 7 years. And you sort of add all of that up, and somehow it adds up to 25 years of working on Capitol Hill. I don't know how it happened. It just sort of happened that way.
That's really, really impressive. So it took a bit longer than you originally expected, and you're still there, which is a beautiful thing. And arguably, Washington is the center of world power politics. That's really the place to be, where everything comes together. Now that you're advising international clients from that seat, what does being part of a global network add to the work? And what sort of surprised you the most about public affairs from the private side after serving your time in the public side first?
Yeah, I would say where I got my true appreciation for where Washington intersects with the world was really years ago. My time working for the late Congressman Alcee Hastings, who represented a district in South Florida, but he got himself involved in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Parliamentary Assembly. The OSCE has its secretariat in Vienna, but the Parliamentary Assembly has its secretariat in Copenhagen, Denmark, and it brings together parliamentarians from the 57 parliaments and countries that have signed the Helsinki Final Act and successive agreements. And Congressman Hastings was the American member of Congress that has probably gotten himself most active in the parliamentary dimension of the OSCE. And I led his efforts at the staff level there. He got himself first involved on one of the committees in the OSCE EPA. He led one of the committees. Then he was elected vice president of the assembly. And then back in 2004, he got himself elected president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And to this day, he's the only American to be elected president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And for me, it really got me more involved in international politics than I had ever expected to be. There had been a Portuguese president, a Swedish president of the Parliamentary Assembly, a British president of the Parliamentary Assembly. So on a daily basis, I was interacting with staff members of parliaments from around the world, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, British, Dutch, you name it, as actively as I was with staff members on Capitol Hill. And I realized very quickly, if you wanted to get something done down the street or in Westminster, you needed to have relationships all over the world. And I think that's something that I appreciate today. And as you and I are involved in the Mosaic Network, which is, I think, what you were alluding to, it's absolutely essential to have relationships in Washington, in Warsaw, in Doha, in Dubai, in Cairo, or in Copenhagen. You have to have these relationships. And ideally, they're relationships that have been formed over, 20, 25 years.
Totally agree. Beautifully said, Fred. And I wonder, with the shift then from the public to the private sector, do you sometimes miss the public sector? Because it sounds like you had a really good time. It was an incredible learning experience, a growth experience, but also a great way to build your international network. Do you sometimes miss the public sector looking back?
Yeah, without question. Without question. I love where I am right now, but I loved the public sector as well. And sometimes people use the term revolving door pejoratively here in Washington, D.C., and that refers to people coming out of government, going to the private sector, and then going back into public service. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. And if given the opportunity to serve either back on Capitol Hill or perhaps work in an administration, which I've never done before, working in the White House or perhaps at the State Department or Commerce Department or for the U.S. Trade Representative or something like that, I would absolutely take that opportunity. And I would use two recent examples of former colleagues who came out of BGR Group, where I am right now. One, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, was a former colleague up until 2 years ago. And even more recently, my former colleague, Marvin Figueroa, who just 4 months ago was tapped by the new governor of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, to become Virginia's new Secretary of Health and Human Resources. So there are two recent examples of both Secretary Duffy and Secretary Figueroa, who were in the public sector, came to BGR, and now have returned to serving the American public or the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia in new roles. So I love what I'm doing now, but if at some point in the future there's an opportunity to serve again, I would love to do it.
Great people are needed in both sectors. I think that's very clear. What was for you the key reason why you said, hey, it's now time to shift and move from the public to the private sector? Was there a certain moment or was it more opportunity driven? How did that change for you and that shift happen?
What I've found is that people have said to me, you've had good luck in your career, whether being chief of staff for a member of the House or staff director of the Helsinki Commission or chief of staff for a U.S. senator. They've said, Fred, you've had good luck. And what I found is that preparation and opportunity is where luck happens. And what I've also found is that usually somewhere around the 5, 6, 7 year mark for me is where I feel like I've done a job for a certain amount of time. I've mastered the skills, the talents, the abilities, and then I tend to be ready for the next challenge. That seems to be around the time, could be plus or minus. So that seems to be my interval. I was at the Helsinki Commission for 7 years. I was a Senate Chief of Staff for roughly 7 years. I was a House Chief of Staff for about 8 years. So that seems to have been about my rotation. I could have stayed as a Senate Chief of Staff for longer, but this is when the opportunity with BGR came my way, and I thought this would be the time for my next challenge. So that was about the right time, and I figured, okay, I'm ready for the next challenge. I've learned a lot from being a Senate Chief of Staff, and now it's time to apply what I've learned to the next opportunity.
I love that. And we want to learn from your know-how and your experience here. So I really want to dive a bit deeper into the craft of international public affairs in Washington, D.C. So let's maybe start first with how you read the landscape. So let's say a new international client walks in, and what are sort of the first three questions that you ask before recommending any engagement strategy, just to sort of qualify and a bit understand what might be the best approach here?
Usually the first question I ask is, what is your goal in Washington, D.C.? What are you trying to accomplish? Right? Something has brought them into our office or over the screen, right? Is it a public sector client? Is it the foreign ministry of a certain country or an embassy? What are they trying to accomplish? So that's the first question. The second question is, and it's related to the first one, but it's important. What have they done so far? And if they haven't been successful, why do they think that is? Right? And the third one is, there are more than three questions. Obviously, normally in a first get together, we'd like to have an hour or 2 hours to really, to really have an exhaustive conversation. Or what are the different tools that they would like to use in whatever their strategy is. I know in the last podcast, you talked with our friend Jessica. Do they want to have a full advocacy strategy? Does that include public relations? Does it include lobbying? Or do they just want to have an advisory type of relationship? Some clients, whether in the public sector, like an embassy or foreign ministry, or in the private sector, let's say a foreign-based company, they don't want to have a lobbying registration, and they just want to use us to gather intelligence or advisory services. And so that's an important question that we need to know. So those are probably our top question to ask. So what tools or services do they want to use from us?
Makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned before the importance of the network that you're building, right? And that, of course, takes a lot of time. And at the same time, it also seems that the lobbying landscape has changed enormously across the different presidents that are also acting in DC, across Clinton, Obama, now Trump. Has access to members and staff generally become harder, or is there a golden era of Washington lobbying that is simply gone? If you think back of the old days that are sometimes romanticized in movies or tales that we tell each other.
No, I don't really think it's changed dramatically. I think that rules have changed in that when there are scandals, and this is not unique to Washington, D.C. Certainly, the European Union has faced some scandals recently. We need only look at issues related to the World Cup, for example, recently, and other issues regarding travel to Brussels, for example. So the United States is not unique in that way. I think we're a little bit ahead of the curve in how we regulate both foreign and domestic lobbying here in Washington. But no, I think, look, as far as access to policymakers and regulators, you see all the time people being wined and dined at Mar-a-Lago, perhaps more so than any administration in the past. And as far as on Capitol Hill, I think staff members are accessible and not in a negative way. I think members of Congress are accessible, again, not in a negative way. I'd like to see more members of Congress leaving the country, not just members of the House and Senate Foreign Affairs committees and Armed Services committees. I think, there was a time when members of Congress bragged that they didn't have a passport, and there were members of Congress who said anything I needed to learn about the world I could get in a briefing in the Capitol building. To me, that's an ignorant statement. Members of Congress should be going out, as I said, to Belgrade or to Pristina or to Prague, you name it. That's the way to learn about the world.
Yeah, and in the end, you have a mandate from your own people, right, to serve them. So I think just relying on a briefing instead of trying to really understand what's going on and seeing it yourself might be too short.
And in a world that is so now interconnected, where you name it, from global commerce, agriculture, cars. I mean, there are so few products that are genuinely just made in America or just made in Japan or just made in South Africa. There's very few places in America that are untouched by some other place in the world. So it truly is ignorant for a member of the national legislature, for the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House of Representatives to say, I don't need to travel anywhere else in the world to understand issues that impact my constituency.
Absolutely. There's another important topic I want to touch upon, and it's not only coming from international clients, but I assume probably even more so by, looking at Washington, D.C. and engaging on the political lobbying there. Often they need to sort of justify the return on any investment made. Like, what do we get back when we spend amount X on advisory, on support, on lobbying? Because often the KPI is nothing happened. So it's quite hard to make that measurable. What is the actual outcome? What is the actual return on that investment? How do you navigate these conversations with your clients? Because I'm sure that always comes up, and great, nothing happens is probably not going to cut the ROI discussion.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the ideal client has some idea of the American system coming into the relationship. I met recently with the prime minister of a country in their national capital, and they said to me, look, the goal here for us is not to be mentioned in a Truth Social post by the President of the United States. That's the goal. So it is, as you said, it is the absence of action that we define as success. We want to fly under the radar for the next, 2.5 to 3 years. So if you can help us do that, that's terrific. We sort of want to keep our heads down. We feel like we have a good relationship with the United States, and we're a little bit nervous that we may do something wrong, and that'll attract the attention of the president, and we'll wake up, we'll go to sleep one night and we wake up in the morning, and all of a sudden there will be tariffs and there'll be a trade war and troops will be coming or going. We don't want that. And we've never had lobbyists before, but we think it's worth a small investment to make sure we'll just, keep doing what we're doing. So look, that's a pretty sophisticated understanding of the American system. So that's terrific. And we said, okay, Prime Minister, we think we can help you with that. And our suggestion would perhaps be both some intelligence gathering, some advocacy, and also some affirmative public relations that just keeps the relationship where it should be, right? So, but it shows some that that message direct from the head of state shows a pretty sophisticated understanding of the US landscape. That's harder if you don't have that understanding right now. If you meet with an ambassador who says, "Look, we want to stop something that's going through the US Congress." Okay, we can help with that. Now they have to explain back to their national capital, here was legislation that was moving through the Congress. If it had turned into public policy, it would have had a negative impact on us. It would have been detrimental to our trade relationship with the United States by $40 billion US, and the absence of that, so hopefully it's able to be explained. And by us spending, X euros or dollars or whatever the local currency is to stop that, yes, we had that spend and now we are at status quo. It was worth it. Hopefully that's able to be translated. And then the flip side of that, obviously, is look, if we hire this lobbying firm, we can help get this treaty signed. We can help get this arms sale through. That's much easier to say, look, we spent this money and we have this tangible result. That's much easier.
Makes a ton of sense. And also, it's really interesting to see that it can differ so much case by case. Some really can calculate it very in all the details and others cannot. But it sounds like all of these bets can be quite asymmetric upsides. You invest a small amount and the outcome can be very significantly by a magnitude of multiple X's higher in a positive but also negative sense, technically, right?
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And look, that also determines the strategy that you take, right? So if the goal is to get a bilateral economic treaty signed between the United States and country X, right? Then you're probably going to try and work with two different places within the US federal government, right? With the Office of the US Trade Representative, with Ambassador Greer and his staff, and then also with the relevant committees in Congress, with the Senate Finance Committee, both majority and minority staff, right? And on the House of Representatives side, the Ways and Means committees, the majority and minority staff, right? If it's an arms sale that you want to get completed, you'd be working with the Pentagon and the Armed Services committees in Congress, right? So those are the ones that, if it's a different topic, then you would be working with different committees and different parts of the administration. So you focus your lobbying work based on what the ultimate goal is.
And your experience is really fascinating to me because I want to also go back to your time in the public sector when you were chief of staff to the chairman of the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. What did the most effective external advocates or lobbyists do that the rest never did, that really stuck out and sort of at least got your attention?
I would say what they did, and I give this advice to people all the time. It's a lot easier to make a friend when you don't need a friend, right? So the most effective advocates, lobbyists, those involved in public affairs, they're making relationships when they don't need a relationship, right? So those are people who, when I was a young staffer, we're becoming friends, we're making relationships. They don't need anything from me, right? So, or they're doing things for the members of Congress that I work with and work for, supporting them. Look, everybody knows that the U.S. has a system that I wouldn't necessarily say other countries should emulate, It costs a lot of money to run elections in this country, millions of dollars to run races for the House of Representatives and the Senate. Not saying that that should be duplicated in other places. Nevertheless, but supporting candidates in their election campaigns when they're junior members of Congress. So that way, in a year, 2 years, 5 years, when you finally do need something from them, you can say, I supported you 5 years ago when I didn't need anything from you. Remember? I was with you from the beginning. That's really, that's it's smart, right? It's much harder when you're the guy that comes in for the first time and has to make a relationship with that member of Congress when you're in a crisis and you have to introduce yourself for the first time when you've got a problem. I say it all the time. It's really hard to make a friend when you need a friend. Make those friends early when you need nothing. When somebody comes into office for the first time and you just go in to introduce yourself, maybe because you have a business in the district, or even if you're a foreign company and you employ people in that district, or you sell things in that district, or you have a diaspora community in that district. You mentioned before we started recording that you are interviewing me this morning from Portugal. The Portuguese have a vibrant diaspora community in the United States. So perhaps if you are the government of Portugal or a Portuguese company, that's something that maybe you're talking to a member of Congress from California or from New York or New Jersey or Rhode Island, where the Portuguese diaspora has a community. You may want to go in and talk to a newly elected member of Congress from one of those places and introduce yourself and say, we have a diaspora community here. And you never know, because you may come back in a year or 2 or 5 years and say, we have a problem. And somebody will say, oh, I remember you. You came in and made friends with me when you needed nothing. That's something that the good advocates do. And the ones who don't come in for the first time when they're in a time of crisis.
I absolutely love this concept. I think it's so powerful and really a long-term strategic thinking well ahead of time, and also a bit of an investment in that relationship. Beautifully explained, Fred. Thank you. Another thing I want to mention is bipartisanship. It seems to be quite a uniquely American concept that can confuse international clients that want to do business in the US. Can you explain how it works operationally and whether it still holds as a real strategy under Trump 2.0?
Sure. Well, I'll take the second part of the question first, perhaps. It's getting more difficult over the past several years, for sure. Bipartisanship, obviously, is the two parties working together on behalf of some shared goal. It's a little bit unique in our system because we're one of the few countries, I think, that really has only a two-party system. Most places around the world have a multipolar, multi-partisan system. The UK maybe is similar to us over the last century or so with Labour and the Tories, although occasionally they'll have a multi-party government. Certainly it looks like they're moving to a more multi-party system in the years ahead, with the ascendancy of Reform and the Greens, and previously with Lib Dems, et cetera. But the U.S. from the get-go has really had a two-party system that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And certainly with the nature of the way our Congress works, you really do need to have some bipartisanship to get major legislation through the Congress. And it's been tougher recently. It used to be, and Jessica alluded to this in her last conversation with you, it used to be where a president of one party and a Congress of another party could fight like hell during the day, but then at the end of the day could get a drink or smoke a cigar together after hours. And that's really where the deals were cut. And famously, President Ronald Reagan, who had Irish heritage in him, and the longtime Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, had different priorities. But after business hours, President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill could find some common ground and have some cocktails together, and they would cut some legislative deals. So you don't see that quite as much anymore, and it's a little bit difficult. But we have found sometimes that when you have a president of one party and a Congress of another party, that has achieved some of the biggest legislative accomplishments over the last several generations, between Ronald Reagan and a Democratic Congress, or President Clinton and a Republican Congress, or President Obama and a Republican Congress. So it's been a little bit more difficult, especially with President Trump and a Democratic Congress or president. It's been a little bit more difficult. So we'll see if the Congress flips later this year, as some people have predicted. We'll see how that plays out. There are still deal makers in Congress. They're just fewer and further between right now.
I bet it's certainly a very interesting time to be working in Washington, D.C. these days. There's always something happening and something going on.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. I think there's an old Chinese proverb or Chinese curse that says you should live in interesting times, and I think we are.
Definitely. Another part of these interesting times are tariffs and sanctions that are now an active daily tool of the US foreign policy. How has the day-to-day practice of international public affairs shifted since January 2025?
President Trump came in both in 2016 and 2024 with an America First policy agenda. Some people have argued whether that's America First or America Alone. I don't think this would surprise you. And if you've looked it up, all of my time on Capitol Hill was working for congressional Democrats. So I tend to lean towards the side of that you can be America First without being America Alone. That is not the course that President Trump has taken. And I think Prime Minister Carney of Canada spelled it out quite eloquently in Davos earlier this year, sort of gave the rebuttal on behalf of the rest of the world, in my view. So I would say to your listeners, if you haven't watched or read Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos, I would commend that to your attention very highly. So the previous world order that had previously been backed by the United States and other world powers for the past, since, in the post-World War II era, President Trump, I think, said he was going to take an axe to, and he has done rather dramatically and successfully. I will say that. He has weaponized the use of tariffs, notwithstanding the actions of the U.S. Supreme Court. And he has started a different direction for the United States. And therefore, the rest of the world is going to have to react to that. Do I think that ultimately redounds to the U.S. benefit? I do not. And we will see how that plays out over the next 5, 10, 25, and 50 years. The U.S. has achieved dramatic economic growth in the post-World War II era. So has the rest of the world, but the U.S. more so than any other country in the post-World War II era. And that's because of the structures that were built up since that time. So I guess it will be for others to decide over the next 50 to 75 years whether destroying those structures is in the long-term interests of the United States. I suspect not.
What do you advise to clients, especially governments, I guess, in that sense? Let's say in Europe, for example, I bet you got many calls and emails from governments and also companies over in Europe when the tariffs were first announced. What is sort of the toolkit that they can use in such a situation to avoid bigger damage? And what is simply the advice? Hey, this is just not going to move the needle. You have to sort of arrange yourself with it. Is there a toolkit that you recommended that you could play, or was it more like, good luck, there's not much you can do?
There's absolutely a toolkit for sure. It really depends on who you're talking to. If you're part of the European Union, you're in a sense a little bit hamstrung in the sense that these countries cannot, by definition, freelance, right? You're part of the EU, so you're going to have to negotiate with the US as part of the EU. The UK, in a sense, by withdrawing from the EU, and for some other time, we can debate whether that was a good move or not a good move for the UK, and I'll leave that to our British colleagues to have that debate. But at least in this one narrow sense, they can have their own negotiations outside of the EU. But sure, there's a toolkit. Look, you've seen world leaders coming in and out of Washington and trying to cut their own deals to try and deal with their own reality. You've seen Erdogan come in, you've seen Modi come in, you've seen the new prime minister of Japan come in. We can fill in the blank, world leaders from South America, Africa, all over the world. So sure, there's a toolkit, whether they come to Washington, whether they're going to Mar-a-Lago, whether they're meeting on the margins of some other regional meetings. They're trying their best to cut a deal that's best for their own people and their own countries. Claudia Sheinbaum has tried one strategy. Mark Carney has tried a different strategy, right? What I think is unfortunate, frankly, is we're about less than a few weeks out from the opening kickoff of the World Cup. When this World Cup, the first one ever to be shared by 3 countries, the idea, and it's almost quaint now, the idea was to showcase how close these 3 countries are, not just geographically, of course, but the idea was to show the partnership, the friendship, the unity of North America, the friendship between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Now, the irony that is displayed today, because there's so much acrimony between the 3 countries, it's really, I find, so ironic. I think if Mexico and Canada could pull out of co-hosting the World Cup today, they would do it in a heartbeat, absolutely in a heartbeat. And when the idea to come up with a 3-nation co-hosting bid came up, there was such immense pride to do it this way. And the irony of it all is really almost too much to fathom right now.
It's a good reminder how fast times can change, I would say. And in that sense, during the World Cup, there will also be 4th of July, obviously. And this year, it's going to be a very special one because the US turns 250. You've spent your career inside this system, now on both sides, private and public sector. Will the anniversary deepen Americans' connection to their institutions, or are you seeing people turn away, like other countries turn away? How is that inside the US with its own citizens?
I think there was a real opportunity to deepen connections to institutions for America 250. I don't think that's going to happen here, unfortunately. And I think it's not just here in the US. I think you're seeing a deep distrust in institutions, not just here in the United States, but I think it's a global phenomenon. Look, with the UK pulling out of the EU, that's probably the most significant example of a people pulling away from an institution in the last generation. I can't think of a better one, frankly. But you also you also see parties in other countries within the EU using pulling out of the EU as a strong rallying cry, right? So I think you see a decline in people's trust in institutions generally. And what you see in the US, even as we celebrate our 250th independence, you see in a lot of parts, and I'm not saying this as a partisan, although it's going to come out as a partisan statement, you're seeing the celebration as more of a celebration of our current leadership, frankly. You're seeing something that's never happened in this country before, a celebration of the incumbent president, renaming of cultural institutions, airports, roadways, etc., something that we used to do for former presidents, dead presidents, et cetera, not for current office holders. So you're seeing something that's done in other parts of the world that was never that was never done here in this country. So I think that may appeal to a small part of the US population, but I think it's turning off a larger part of this country, and it's not making people feel good about their institutions more generally. And as somebody who's spent the bulk of their professional life inside institutions, I don't think that's a good thing. John McCain, the late John McCain, who spent almost his entire adult life serving the American people, first in the US military and then in the US Congress. He once commented that the popularity of the US Congress was so low that it was basically paid staffers and family members. And he said it as a joke, but it's basically true. So there's got to be something better when the popularity of Congress and other institutions is pretty low. We've got to do something to change that.
Definitely, there's something wrong if that's the case. I have another, maybe a bit more positive question, hopefully, before we wrap things up. There has been very, very popular Netflix series, House of Cards. It was a pure global phenomenon, and probably many of us have watched it. You spent 25 years in that system that was part of the series. And I wonder, how realistic was it? What did they get most spectacularly wrong? And what was actually very well done and very accurate, given your vast experience in that space?
So you think talking about House of Cards is gonna elevate this dialogue?
I don't know. We'll find out.
This was a TV show that was about scheming, murder. I don't know. So I'll give it a shot. And I think, by the way, it was based off of originally a British show. So much of what we have in the United States, it started in the UK and then made its way across the Atlantic. So, it's what's really interesting and also almost a little bit sad. It was, art imitating life or life imitating art. It starred Kevin Spacey. And then, at some point, production had to stop because Kevin Spacey got involved in a bit of a scandal himself. So it was like scandal and scandal in the show and scandal in real life. And look, there was some of that TV show, of course, which was just, complete fiction. But what can I say? I think we've had more members of Congress just in the last, 3 or 4 months resign due to scandal than we have in the last generation or so. You know, anybody who's been paying attention to the U.S. House of Representatives has noticed this. So, on the one hand, perhaps that's good for transparency's sake that members of Congress have been forced to resign due to scandal. On the other hand, people are right to ask themselves, just, what the hell is going on here? Who are the American people voting into office, and what's happening once they get into office? So, look, I don't think there's murder for hire. I don't think happening, but the other thing people say is, well, the U.S. Congress is a good cross section of the American public. We have roughly 330 million people in the United States, and it's not a government completely of angels. Thomas Jefferson said, if we were a country of nothing but angels, then we wouldn't need government at all, would we? So.
Good point. Let me try with another positive twist to end, because at the beginning, you said that you focus on sort of fulfilling your roles within 5-6 years, normally, plus minus a few years if necessary and if it makes sense. Looking back, you joined BGR in 2021, so this 5-year is already coming up, the 5th one. What does your future look like? Do you have any plans to change or to move to another role somewhere?
Well, it's a great question, and as I said, at the get-go, man plans and God laughs. So I don't know what's next. You're right. I've been at BGR now coming on about 5 years, and I love the work that I do here. Great colleagues, great people, great clients. Love the international work that I do. So there's always opportunity for personal growth and professional growth. So who knows what's coming down the pike or around the next corner. For now, I love what I'm doing, and we'll see what happens.
Let's put it that way. The next 1 or 2 years will be particularly interesting to watch your moves.
For sure.
So, Fred, to wrap up today, I also have some rapid fire questions for you. I'm just going to fire right away. Let's go. What is one trait every effective hill-facing advocate must have?
Flexibility. I don't know if you're a boxing fan, but Mike Tyson used to say everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, and then you have to replan again. So have to have flexibility.
What's the best piece of advice that you still use from your Hill years?
Best piece of advice that I still use from my don't get outworked.
I love that. What's the most overrated tactic in international public affairs?
The press conference. Nothing gets done at a press conference.
Good one. What's one foreign policy issue that Washington is dangerously underrating or underattending to right now?
I sort of alluded to this earlier. It's absolutely self-centered, but the U.S.-Canada relationship, we are completely underattending. It's either, depending on which metric you use, either our second or third biggest trading partner in the world. And considering the state of the relationship right now, which is completely in tatters, it's a huge, huge mistake, and we are completely under attending it.
Good one. Last one for you, Fred. If you could change one thing about how lobbying is regulated or perceived, what would it be?
Well, I would change the perception. I think the perception is that, all people are doing are being wined and dined and, smoking cigars, and people aren't actually working at it. And there aren't people who understand policy and politics and press and procedure. And you need to understand all of those things in order to achieve a policy outcome. And I think that's what we've been talking about over the last hour. And so for those people who hear the term, oh, you're a lobbyist, that must mean all you do is go out to dinner and make a campaign donation and your job is done here. I think that's really unfair. I think you really need to understand how the system works and how amendments are crafted and how the House Rules Committee works and how House and Senate floor procedure works and how the regulatory process works in the United States or in Brussels or in Cairo or in South Africa or in Brazil, or, we could go around the world. But all of these things matter. And if problems need to be solved, sometimes those problems can be solved in Washington. But my time working within the OSCE is also relevant to getting a problem solved. And if I can call somebody that now works somewhere around the Ringstrasse or in Westminster, or in Copenhagen or wherever, my understanding of the way the process works, not just in Washington, but maybe in Warsaw, all of that matters. And that can't just be done from a dinner sitting at Morton's on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. And I'd love to change that perception.
That's the perfect way to end this conversation. Very well said, Fred. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I was absolutely fascinated by your experience, your insights, and really honored to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Really my pleasure. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
You've been listening to The Pulse of Politics, a Delos podcast about navigating uncertainty in public affairs. For more insights, visit delosanalytica.com.